Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar, COVID-19 and Invasive Species Programs, a webinar put on by the Western Governors Association as part of the WGA Working Lands Roundtable, and also co-hosted as well by the Pacific Northwest Economic Region. I am Bill Whitaker, a policy advisor for the Western Governors Association. I'll be your moderator today, and before we begin, I just want to go over a couple of logistical items. Is that we have five panelists today. Five panelists, and over the course of 2 hours, I'm looking forward to a really good, interesting conversation about how land managers are dealing with the coronavirus situation and adapting. Invasive species managers are adapting in the face of the coronavirus situation. But I also am looking forward to having a good discussion at the end of this, and we're looking forward to hearing from the attendees as throughout this event. So if you're joining as an attendee, you are on mute right now. All generally attendees are on mute, but the flow of this will be, we'll begin with panelists. We'll begin with some opening remarks from Jim Ogsberry, WGA's Executive Director, and then some remarks from the Pacific Northwest Economic Region, and then move on to our panelist presentation. But we are looking to save at least 30 or 40 minutes at the end for dialogue and a moderated discussion and question and answers. And for that, we'd really love to have your input and your questions. So please submit your questions using this platform. If you look up at your screen, there is a Q&A function on the sort of a speech bubble with some lines in it. That's where you can submit your Q&A questions. Send those to me, and I will pass them along to the presenter. Also, there's an attendee chat. If you look on your left-hand side, there's an attendee chat bar that will you can use to talk, speak to your fellow attendees. And then this event is also being recorded right now, and will be available at the WGA YouTube channel and website shortly after we finish today. So with that, I would just say thank you everyone for joining, and I'll hand it over to Jim Ogsberry, the Executive Director of the Western Governors Association.
Thanks, Bill, and thanks to everybody who's taken the time to join us for this presentation on COVID-19 and invasive species programs. I'm sure I don't have to convince anybody that the current public health threat has had just unthinkably pervasive impacts throughout society. Our lives, our jobs, our routines have all, to some extent, been disrupted by COVID-19. I would hazard, however, that when most people think about the impacts of the coronavirus, they're most likely to consider its effects on healthcare systems, on the economy, and on social interaction. They are less apt to think about COVID-19's impacts on resource management and invasive species. Those impacts, though, are very real and very significant. So I'm really proud that we've assembled such a dedicated group of experts who are equipped to think very deeply about invasive species in the context of a viral pandemic. Today's webinar is being produced in partnership with the Pacific Northwest Economic Region and under the auspices of WGA's Working Lands Roundtable. The Working Lands Roundtable was formed in 2018 as a platform to coordinate ongoing work generated by the resource-based initiatives of past WGA chairs, such as the Biosecurity and Invasive Species Initiative of Hawaii Governor David Ige, the National Forest and Rangeland Management Initiative of Montana Governor Steve Bullock, and the Species Conservation and Endangered Species Act initiative of former Wyoming Governor Matt Mead. Moreover, the Working Lands Roundtable provides a rich forum to examine the complex interrelationships of these and other resource issues in a cross-cutting, multidisciplinary way. The Roundtable is providing intellectual feedstock for Western governors as they pursue cross-boundary policy solutions to the challenges faced by Western working landscapes and the communities they support. Today's webinar is being held on the recommendation of the Western Invasive Species Council, which was launched by Western governors 1 year ago this month to enhance coordination between existing state invasive species councils, to improve communication and collaboration on regional biosecurity and invasive species control efforts, and to advocate for regional needs at the federal level. To date, 17 Western governors have appointed members to the council. And since its launch, the council has supported Western governors with its work on invasive species data management, invasive annual grasses, and transboundary feral hog management. We thank the members of WISC for their service. And finally, I'd like to especially thank Matt Morrison and Steve Myers and the Pacific Northwest Economic Region, WGA's co-host for this presentation. PNWAR has been a tremendous national leader on invasive species issues for years and years, and we could not be prouder to associate with this powerful and effective organization. I'm looking forward to today's conversation, so to get it started, I'll turn the program back to Bill.
Thank you, Jim. And then I will turn the conversation over to PNWAR. Steve, would you like to just say a few words on how this got started and PNWAR's involvement in the issue?
Oh, yes, thanks, Bill. Appreciate it. And yeah, I'd like to second Jim's comments about the importance of natural resource management and the invasive species threat to the region. For those that aren't familiar with the Pacific Northwest Economic Region, we have been dealing with invasive species work for just a little over 15 years, looking at a number of different aspects. In recent years, the focus has been a lot on the quadrant zebra mussel threat from regions outside the Columbia River Basin, and we've done a lot of work with our federal partners to get more awareness, and then also just share best practices from states that have established inspection stations around the region. With this, I would also like to send along the support from our working group co-chairs, Representative Terry Justin from the state of Idaho, and then also Kate Wilson, the Commission Administrator for the Montana Department of Natural Resource and Conservation. Again, we'd like to thank all the speakers and attendees for taking some time today to talk about these issues. We were looking forward to having our annual summit this year in Big Sky, Montana, but because of the public health issues that are currently underway, we've had to postpone our summit to next August in Big Sky, Montana for 2021. So we're going to continue, though, to have this dialogue. This webinar was a great opportunity to partner with the Western Governors Association and others. And we're going to continue to have these types of events in format in virtual. So if anybody has any more information they'd like to share with us or to learn more about some of the work that we're going to be doing throughout the year, please feel free to visit our website at www.pnwer.org. Thanks again, Bill, and Lee, I'm going to kick it back to you.
Great, thank you, Steve. And with that, we'll turn to the panelist presentations portion. We are joined here today by Karen Hickman, a professor and director of environmental science for the environmental science program at the Ferguson College of Agriculture for Oklahoma State University. And Karen is also the Oklahoma appointee to the Western Invasive Species Council, so it's great to have a WISC member on this as well. We're also joined by Robert Walters, the Invasive Species Specialist for Colorado Parks and Wildlife, Nathan Owens, the Aquatic Invasive Species Coordinator for the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources, Josh Shorb, the Supervisor for the Park County Weed and Pest District, and Lauri Hanauska-Brown, the Nongame Wildlife Management Director for the Wildlife Division of Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. So with that, I will just encourage all the audience members to think of questions and then send them our way if you have any, and I will hand the presentation over to Karen. So Karen, go ahead.
Thank you, Bill, and I got clicker happy, and you've seen the second slide already. So I just want to say thank you to the Western Governors Association and the Pacific Northwest Economic Region, and for kind of organizing and sponsoring this and getting and Bill's assistance in gathering all of the speakers today. I've been afforded the opportunity to kind of be philosophical in this particular talk. And so I hope you'll allow me to take some leeway and kind of stretch some things as we basically approach this talk. The way I approached it was based upon my course that I taught this semester. I have the opportunity to teach an ecology of invasive species course here at Oklahoma State University to seniors in natural resources, and then also to graduate students. And prior to their leaving campus for spring break, we had gone over a lot of the concepts associated with invasive species ecology. And in a couple lectures prior to them leaving for spring break, we thought it might be possible that they would not be coming back to campus, which proved to be true. And I encouraged them to apply the concepts of invasive species ecology to COVID-19. I realized that COVID-19 is a pathogen. Many people don't view it as an invasive species, but I'm going to take the liberty to kind of view it that way and apply some of those concepts that we typically would use for our invasive plants and animals to help us potentially utilize the citizens and the public's awareness of COVID-19, use that awareness and knowledge to help us in educating them and educating the public about the concerns we have associated with the invasive species that are affecting our systems. And so as I move through this talk, I really kind of want to focus on, we know that the public has seen these types of graphs. They've seen the flattening the curve graph in the upper right. They've heard about, so if we use these particular measures, quarantine, masks, don't shake hands, limit exposure, be very careful in cleaning, we know that we can reduce the spread of COVID-19. They've seen the graph on the left that shows the worldwide occurrence of COVID-19. And many of them have also seen the graphs that look at predictive models associated with how COVID-19 might be present or reduced in the future. And so I'd like us to think as we manage our natural resources to protect them or battle against invasive species, I'd like to take some of the knowledge that the public is learning about COVID-19 and flip that to something that we might be able to take advantage of in increasing their knowledge about invasive species. So if we look at this graph, they've seen this. This comes from a website that updates it daily. I had the opportunity to update it this morning. The public has seen this. In March, when I spoke to my students, the curve was not on that rapid incline, and the students were really kind of battling, as were many of the public members. They were battling on whether or not this was truly going to become that pandemic. And as we've seen, it certainly has. And that graph, we can really divide it up. And I went to our worldindata.org and accessed different graphs of COVID-19 confirmed cases for various countries. And I selected about 7 or 8 different countries, really based on a personal reason. If these are, I have family members that may be in country or friends or relatives that are there. And so I was kind of wanting to just see how different countries have really had spikes in or maybe reduced the occurrence of COVID-19 cases. And so I just kind of look at the graph for the United States, and I think that really is kind of that classic curve that we associate with invasive species invasions. And I found there's many graphs that are like this that show stages of invasion and that population growth curve that many of us we're very familiar with as it pertains to invasive species. But as we go through this presentation, my goal is to apply concepts that we know about invasive species to this graph and potentially utilize that thought in helping us educate the public and take advantage of their knowledge that they're gaining about COVID-19 and apply that to our battle of animal or plant invasive species. So as we go through, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about a variety of concepts of invasion ecology. And the first one, I think Jim pointed this out, one of the biggest reasons why we care about invasive species, number one reason, harm to human health. When I ask my students about their knowledge is about invasive species, They all can identify the Africanized honeybee. They can all identify the red imported fire ant. They know those animals because they have harm to human health. COVID-19 certainly has that. Harm to the economy, that typically is the second reason why people will care about invasive species. The third, typically on the list, is harm to biodiversity. We know that with COVID-19, we've hit the top two, harm to human health, harm to the economy, and was alluded to by some of the speakers earlier, is that we are harming biodiversity because of COVID-19's actions. We aren't being able to go out and manage for those invasive species as much as we would like. Then we could go to the concept of stages of invasion. So introduction, initial colonization, establishment, and then that subsequent dispersal, and then impact. Many times we have to go through those first three that were listed before we see that impact, but certainly in the instance of COVID-19, that first colonization and successful establishment, we did see that impact. Part of the issue associated with the introduction and that initial colonization is that we really have to identify the invasive. And so for us, it's sometimes sending a specimen in that has to be identified by an expert. For COVID-19, it was that testing to be able to find that viral pathogen and identify that viral pathogen. We know that successful invasions many times are going to have repeated introductions. We've seen that certainly with COVID. We've seen that with the species that you work with. High propagule pressure. I would say high viral loads. We've seen high viral loads in some of our larger cities really increase the incidence and occurrence of COVID-19. We know there are multiple routes of introduction of the invasive species that we work with. Ballast water, contaminated soil, vehicular travel. We could have accidental or intentional introductions. So many of those routes of introduction we could actually think of relative to COVID being those accidental introductions and the fact that they were coming from a variety of places. And then that lag time. Many times invasive species that we manage tend to have a pretty long lag time before they become noticeable and cause an impact. That is when the public becomes aware of them, is after the impact has occurred. So we know for COVID-19 that lag time was very short. We also know from our management practices that if we can hit an invasive species during that lag time, the opportunity for eradication is increased tremendously. We know prevention is key. We have APHIS, conducting border inspections. We have quarantines that we have. USDA quarantines counties for movement of soil to prevent movement of the red imported fire ant, and as well as other species. So we could use those concepts with COVID-19 to help us educate the public about our particular species. Our border inspections for COVID-19 was certainly taking temperatures. The public understands the concepts of quarantine and the difficulties associated with it. But all of those are key in that early detection of the invader and the early detection with identification of the invader, and then having that rapid response. And we've seen in many instances throughout the world, some countries might have a more rapid response than others, just like within our state agencies, our federal agencies, and our different states within the Western Governors Association. Our different states will have different responses to varying invasive species. And then if I could this is a concept of just filtering. So when we talk about invasive species, if you'll focus on the right-hand portion of the diagram, we know that we have a species pool. We know that humans provide the opportunity for various species to cross the biogeographic filter, be it an ocean, be it a landmass. And those introductions then may or may not be successful depending upon the physiological ability of the organism. And if it survives physiologically, it's possible it could be filtered out by a pathogen, by a predator, by the lack of a mutualist. We certainly see that with COVID-19, it has been able to bypass all of those filters. So now let's kind of go back to this graph that I think serves as a really key opportunity for us to help educate the public. So if we have no invader present, we can maintain prevention. If we have an introduction and we can isolate those few introductions at a small level, it's possible eradication could be successful. We know that many of the species we deal with happen to they go on that long lag time and their population expands. They have a rapid population growth, could ultimately be exponential logarithmic. And during that time is typically when public awareness begins. I would challenge us as natural resource managers to try to shift that public awareness to the prevention stage of management. If we could get our public better aware of these problematic species that become invasive, we potentially increase the likelihood of reducing damage to our natural resources. They understand the concept of preventing COVID-19. Possibly we could educate or increase their awareness about various species that aren't present. And that will increase our ability to manage our natural resources without those invasive species. And so as we move through the various graphs that the public has access to, I can focus on a few of these. I'll look at Australia first. Australia certainly has a very low occurrence. Australia is known for its invasive species control. It has extremely rigid regulations and laws in place, and border inspections are very well implemented. Then I'll go to Germany. My husband was stationed in the Air Force in Germany, and so we were talking about this, why Germany might have flattened that curve more. He gave a variety of personal reasons, he thought, but then I decided, so I did some research, and Germany pretty much shut down all large gatherings by March, the beginning of March. They closed schools very quickly. And most importantly, they started identifying the occurrence of the COVID-19. So they were doing over 80,000 tests in a week, and then doing a lot of contact tracing. And so for us, as natural resource managers dealing with invasives, I just think maybe we could utilize that kind of thought process and helping educate the public on increasing their awareness associated with invasives. Again, I told you that this was going to be somewhat philosophical, and I hope you are seeing kind of where my thoughts were associated with how we can educate the public. Because truly, as I moved, there we go. My goal was to apply the concepts of invasion ecology for us to be able to use that as an opportunity to increase the public's knowledge of our invasive species we're concerned about. They've gained knowledge about COVID-19. They understand a lot of these concepts now, and we could potentially take advantage of that knowledge. And with that, I'll stop and take any questions if we have time.
And this is Bill. I'd actually prefer that if folks can just save their questions to the end. I would prefer that.
Thanks.
But thank you, Karen. And then so we can just turn to our next presenter. So Robert, go ahead.
Thanks, Bill, and good afternoon, everyone. As was stated, my name is Robert Walters, and I'm the Invasive Species Specialist for Colorado Parks and Wildlife. Additionally, I have the great pleasure of serving as the Committee Chair for the Western Regional Panel on Aquatic Nuisance Species at Decontamination Think Tank Committee. The intent of this presentation is to describe a set of COVID-19 guidelines for watercraft inspection stations that have been compiled by the Decon Think Tank Committee, as well as discuss some challenges and successes in implementing those best practices. Before describing these guidelines, I'll just provide a little bit of background on the Western Regional Panel and the committee. The Western Regional Panel on Aquatic Nuisance Species is a subcommittee of the ANS Task Force. The mission of the WRP was set forth in the National Invasive Species Act of 1996 and is for the WRP to coordinate ANS activities in the Western United States. The Western Regional Panel membership is comprised of 19 Western states, 4 Canadian provinces, federal agencies, non-governmental organizations, and private industry. The top priority for all members is preventing the spread of zebra and quagga mussels into Western waters. The Decontamination Think Tank is a standing committee of the Western Regional Panel. This committee was created by the Executive Committee of the WRP in January of 2018, and I have had the pleasure of chairing this committee since that time. The committee is comprised almost entirely of experts in the field of watercraft inspection and decontamination who are actively supervising watercraft inspection and decontamination stations, primarily in the Western United States. The primary goal of this committee is to create a collaborative forum for frontline staff supervising inspection stations to allow us to communicate, share information, develop relationships, and solve problems collectively. We hope that this contributes to the overall knowledge base on decontamination and assists with building leadership within aquatic invasive species programs in the West. Primary products of this committee include specifications for decontamination equipment, as well as inspection and decontamination protocols that are being implemented all across the West. As a committee of experts in the field of inspection and decontamination, the Decontamination Think Tank Committee is well suited to develop guidelines or recommendations in response to COVID-19 as it pertains to watercraft inspection and decontamination. So many locations across the western states consider March 1st as the beginning of the recreational boating season. With the onset of the COVID pandemic right around this same time, the range of responses from recreational managers was highly variable. Responses ranged from complete prohibition of recreational boating to the encouragement of public use of recreational waters as an acceptable form of social distancing. For those jurisdictions that leaned towards allowing recreational boating and had active watercraft inspection and decontamination programs in place, 2 things were incredibly clear. First, while most would never think of watercraft inspectors as frontline workers during this pandemic, watercraft inspectors interact with hundreds, if not thousands, of people on a routine basis. Watercraft inspection and decontamination protocols do have the potential to put inspection and decontamination staff, as well as the public, at risk of contracting COVID-19. As is illustrated in this kind of worst-case model images you see there on the slide, boaters in the West are extremely transient. If even one inspector at one location tested positive, it would have the potential to significantly contribute to the spread of COVID. Second, we could not risk allowing recreational boating without continuing to implement watercraft inspection and decontaminations. Additionally, we could not sacrifice the quality of our inspections. As a result, we had to offer whatever protections possible to our staff. Fortunately, at its core, watercraft inspection and decontamination is all about vector management. So for those of us managing these programs, the building blocks were already there. We just had to apply our knowledge to a new practice. So programs that had already started up for the season at the onset of this pandemic, or those that were just about to begin, had to think extremely fast and implement measures to protect staff from exposure while still maintaining the quality of inspections. Several state agencies began putting together their own COVID guidelines to protect their staff and the public. As the weeks passed and some of the initial measures taken were time-tested, the Decontamination Think Tank Committee saw an opportunity to provide timely guidance to those programs that had not yet had an opportunity to come up with their own. Additionally, we saw an opportunity to collectively improve those recommendations that were already in place. Over the course of a couple weeks, the committee reviewed all known existing guidelines and compiled our own. So there are a few different components of these guidelines. First is going to be personal protections. I'm going to show each one of these guidelines on the slides, but certainly will not just read them to you. Instead, I will spend my time discussing the implementation of these guidelines. So first, we want to make sure that we are maintaining 6-foot distance from all humans at all times. This is something we are doing our best at in our day-to-day lives and also in the workplace. While maintaining 6 feet of distance in an outdoor setting may not seem that challenging at first glance, Western states have been training boaters for more than a decade to interact with our inspectors. Some primary points of close contact include face-to-face questionnaires, boarding boats to inspect interior compartments, often in confined areas, and the exchange of paper documents. While we are making all reasonable efforts to maintain 6-foot distance, the boating public continues to encroach on the personal space of our inspectors on a routine basis. Watercraft inspection and decontamination stations are often located in remote or more natural areas and are often nothing more than a small shed in a parking lot. With the remote nature, there are many instances where stations do not have running water, electricity, or really any modern conveniences whatsoever. This makes things that seem simple, such as washing your hands, quite a challenge. All of these things compound to inspection and decontamination stations not always being the cleanliest of work environments. Developing sanitation plans for these sites, including sanitation of all touched and shared equipment and surfaces, is a primary recommendation of these guidelines. In addition to the work site, the job of inspecting and decontaminating boats is certainly not the most sanitary of jobs. Legend has it that my awesome supervisor once applied to have the job featured on Dirty Jobs, although that request was not granted. Routine tasks for inspectors include climbing on and off of people's boats, coming into contact with equipment that may well have been handled by the boater in the very recent past. Getting into someone's boat is not that much different than walking into their home. Some are, let's just say, cleaner than others. Of course, handling equipment and touching surfaces that very likely were just recently handled by a member of the public exposes inspectors to potentially contaminated surfaces. To mitigate this risk, inspection stations are encouraged to provide staff with disposable gloves to wear at their discretion. Many inspectors have elected not to do so, as the gloves limit their ability to perform a tactile inspection. A tactile inspection is a primary component of a thorough watercraft inspection. That's not the worst thing, because disposable gloves are no replacement for hand washing or hand sanitizing. While obtaining hand washing stations has been challenging in many circumstances, many programs have found great success in partnering with local distilleries to produce large quantities of hand sanitizer for inspection and decontamination staff. Many jurisdictions have also required the use of a face covering when working with the public. While many jurisdictions have requested that medical-grade masks be reserved for medical workers, inspection and decontamination programs have had great success in being creative in sourcing face coverings. Awesome folks within our own circle of inspectors and decontaminators have produced hundreds of face coverings for inspectors within their regions. Seamstresses have stepped forward to make and in many cases donate face coverings, and inspectors have even found an opportunity to have a little personal expression in their uniform, as approved by their supervisors, of course. We have also found that wearing facial coverings seems to encourage boaters to wear their own when they are interacting with our inspectors. Like any other public-facing job in this pandemic, it is critically important that anyone exhibiting illness symptoms not report to work. With the amount of people that an inspector may interact with in a given day, it would be irresponsible to report to work with COVID-like symptoms. A very important realization is that having a plan in place for if a technician were to test positive is a much more effective method than responding after the fact. Many agencies have agency-wide response plans in place, so it's not something that we have to draft up just within our inspection and decontamination programs. So familiarizing yourself with those plans in advance and understanding how they would impact and be implemented by our programs is invaluable. Responses may range from quarantine of that single employee to quarantine of the entire crew and shutting down of the inspection station. A further recommendation is to pair technicians with the same individuals across days to reduce exposure to the entire team. While this is certainly a good idea in theory, in practice the reality is that many inspection programs are operating on bare-bones staffing, and very often all hands must be on deck during the busiest of days. Another challenge that we have come to face is that typically the busiest days are Saturday and Sunday. With many of our stay-at-home orders, we are seeing record visitations 7 days a week, every single week. So we are seeing extreme visitation numbers on a day-to-day basis. In typical times, there is a lot of shared equipment that is shared amongst our inspection teams. Things like tablets, seal receipt books, seals, flashlights, wire cutters. With the potential for COVID to spread on surfaces, our committee has recommended that shared supplies be limited and wherever possible, inspectors be provided with their own equipment. This has increased operational costs tremendously. As was previously stated, inspection stations are often not much more than a shed in a parking lot. This does not allow for much social distancing in the workspace. In the colder months, when the seasons were just getting started, inspector numbers were often limited, or inspectors were asked to work from their vehicles to allow for social distancing among staff. As the weather is warming and things are getting much busier, the potential for inspectors to distance themselves outside of the physical work building has allowed for increasing staffing numbers while still maintaining an effective social distance. Is it really a COVID discussion without a little bit of talk about bathrooms? In many circumstances, inspection station staff is required to utilize public restrooms at parks, rest areas, and boat launches. While the awesome folks managing the restrooms do their best, it is challenging to maintain a sanitary environment given the conditions. Wherever possible, it is recommended that inspection station staff be provided their own restroom that they can sanitize themselves. I personally really enjoyed this picture of an employee outhouse that was recently placed by one of our portable restroom companies here in Colorado. They obviously had missed the point about providing separate restrooms for the employees and the public. The guidelines also provide some operational recommendations. A primary one that being outside of the recommendations that are provided, all program procedures and protocols for conducting inspection and decontamination services should be maintained. Again, we cannot sacrifice the quality of our inspections. While there is never any certainty that the public will read signs, it is recommended that the public be informed to maintain social distance and that they are still required to assist with the inspection if requested by the inspection team. A couple of major changes to our typical procedure is that we, in many circumstances, have suspended the issuing of outreach materials, particularly the hand-to-hand exchange of those materials that would require inspectors to come within that 6-foot distance. And has been stated previously, voters have been trained for 10 years to exit their vehicle to help with the inspection. Where possible, inspectors are now being encouraged to allow voters to remain in their vehicle unless they are required to assist with the inspection. Last but certainly not least, there is a fair amount of paperwork that is exchanged during the inspection and decontamination process. While we certainly have not recommended a single method to reduce the hand-to-hand exchange, the committee has compiled several different methods to exchange paperwork without direct interaction. These methods include placing the paperwork in an accessible place on the watercraft with the permission of the watercraft operator, using a tool that allows 6-foot distance to be maintained, a highly technical term here, a grabber tool, And in instances where paperwork typically has to be signed, many jurisdictions are asking the permission of the operator to sign on their behalf to limit direct exposure. If that permission is not granted, then we are allowing the boaters to keep the pen they use to sign as an alternative. Awesome. So that gets me pretty close to the end here. So, of course, the health and safety of our staff is always our #1 priority. While there are certainly challenges in implementing these guidelines and limited ways to gauge their success, as the old saying goes, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. In this scenario, much like with zebra and quagga mussels, the stakes are quite a bit higher. Without healthy, awesome inspectors out on the front line, there is no prevention, and as of today, there is no cure. Thank you for your time and attention, and I greatly appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, Robert. Great presentation. And next up, we have Nathan Owens, the Aquatic Invasive Species Coordinator with the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources. Go ahead, Nate.
Thank you, Bill. Thanks, everyone, for this opportunity. Again, my name is Nathan Owens. I'm the Aquatic Invasive Species Coordinator for the Utah Division of Wildlife, and I will be presenting on watercraft interdiction in Utah, but more specifically, interdiction strategies and approaches at Lake Powell in response to COVID-19. So in Utah, our watercraft interdiction program begins and ends at Lake Powell. Lake Powell is the only water body in Utah infested with either quagga or zebra mussels, but with approximately 400,000 boat launches each year, it poses a serious challenge for us. Working cooperatively with the National Park Service and the state of Arizona, the Utah Division of Wildlife runs the largest invasive mussel containment program in the nation, with funding generously provided by the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Bureau of Reclamation. And our goals are to perform watercraft inspections of all exiting boats during daylight hours at all the main developed launch ramps, and make sure those boats are not taking any contaminated water or mussels out with them. And we also offer professional hot water decontaminations to select boats as well. And we input all of these inspection and decontamination records into the regional watercraft inspection database that the state of Colorado developed and has now been adopted by most, if not all, of the Western states, with additional entities coming aboard as well. Just for reference, we collectively conducted over 100,000 inspections and 4,000 decontaminations at Lake Powell alone in 2019. And for those of you that are part of the Western Regional Panel, you probably know that I seem to present at the annual meeting every year talking about the next nightmare that we experience at Lake Powell, whether it's floating mussels and mussels showing up in the sea strainer, or seemingly reappearing mussels that show up on a boat multiple times down the road coming from Lake Powell. Lake Powell is always keeping us on our toes and is forcing us to not only reevaluate our program, but many times just adapt on the fly to what we're seeing there. And obviously, this year's challenge, COVID-19, is one that we all face. The public health and safety and the health and safety risks to our staff have been greatly increased, and it forces us, just like Robert mentioned, to take several additional steps to make sure that we're keeping everyone safe. The PPE, the personal protective equipment needs, again, Robert went through all that in a great detail, so I'm not going to dive into that too much. But there are also some things at Lake Powell that are fairly unique to Lake Powell itself. Staff hiring has always been a serious challenge for us. Like some of the inspection stations in other states, Lake Powell is very remote, and you combine that with just the incredibly challenging working conditions, the 110, 115 degree temperatures in the summer, the lack of amenities and facilities, and sometimes the lack of housing. COVID really increased all of those dramatically. And we also typically house all of these people in shared housing, which obviously is a problem if you're trying to bring in people from out of state and all of a sudden put them together in a shared space. That's not something we want to do for COVID. So really all this kind of spearheaded and resulted in some severe challenges at Lake Powell. And so kind of, in light of all these challenges and the fact that the PPE needs couldn't be met because there were shortages all over the place, and at least initially, we didn't have a protocol designed with social distancing in mind. How were we going to tackle Lake Powell, where you have potentially a couple thousand boats visiting there each and every weekend, but inspections were not going to be performed? So that is when, on April 1st, the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources Director issued an emergency order, mostly as our response to our inability to maintain social distancing while doing those inspections. The health and safety of our staff and the boaters just couldn't be jeopardized. And like Robert said, we didn't feel like, without some sort of modified protocols and without additional staff, we could thoroughly conduct an inspection, or at least an inspection that to the quality needed to make sure that mussels were not leaving Lake Powell. Just due to the fact that we have had this floating mussel issue, the water level fluctuations complicate things, the number of boats coming out of there on a weekend and the types and complexity of those boats, it all added up to a serious risk. And so this emergency order essentially implemented a 30-day dry time requirement for every boat coming from infested water that was coming to launch in Utah. So no inspection was going to be done, no decontamination was going to be performed. It simply had to remain dry and out of the water for 30 days. We didn't feel like we could tell our staff at Lake Powell, hey, we don't feel comfortable requiring you to do an inspection, but then have our state parks partners or our staff in other locations be forced into doing that inspection later. So then on April 6th, working in consultation with both the states of Utah and Arizona, the National Park Service, made a significant decision, a very difficult one, to close down launch ramps at Lake Powell, at least the developed launch ramps. And I think when this happened, we all knew that this was a very temporary solution to keep people safe and to make sure that mussels were not going to be leaving the area. So we immediately began talking amongst the various agencies on ways and strategies to begin reopening those ramps. The complication here, and I guess the failure mostly on our part, was that nearly a month went by, and the only message that was put out to the public during that time was that the ramps were closed, and they remain closed. And that was a significant lesson learned on our part. Often we operate under the model that we really only need to put out information when things change or when we need to provide updates. For that month, the public had no idea that we were having discussions to talk about reopening ramps at Lake Powell. We didn't send out any updates, and even though we didn't have any specific updates, we still should have conveyed the message that we were working towards solutions, if anything, just so the public wouldn't seek out this information elsewhere and as is oftentimes the case, get that information from inaccurate sources. We had conspiracy theories popping up left and right about who was responsible for shutting down Lake Powell and what was allowed and what was not being allowed there, the timelines for reopening, and if it was actually ever going to reopen. And I think frequent updates would have likely alleviated a lot of that frustration and later some of that anger that was directed at us by the boating community, and probably discouraged a lot of those people from kind of seeking out some of those conspiracy theories. And then towards the middle of May, many of the launch ramps around Lake Powell began reopening to some extent. The Division of Wildlife developed some of these modified inspection and decontamination protocols with social distancing in mind. A lot of those aligned with what Robert previously presented that would allow some of this work to take place. But these protocols were different in that they called for limited interaction between our inspection staff and the boaters, essentially revising their roles in this inspection process. And this is a dramatic change of how we'd been operating at Lake Powell for nearly 10 years, in that we had asked them to be part of the inspection process and to have it be an interactive back and forth between our inspection staff and them, explaining what we were doing, why we were doing it, how they can help us expedite the process in the future. So this was a little bit different, and the question then became, well, how do we ask the public to kind of no longer engage with our staff? We had established expectations up until this point, and now those expectations had to be changed. I know I like to know what to expect in most situations and what role I'm expected to play in, a project, a team, a work assignment. And likewise, the public likes to know that too. And changing expectations, especially on the fly, is not easy. So kind of like what Robert mentioned, we put out several Facebook posts just telling or reminding the boating public not to approach our staff unless they were asked to. At Lake Powell, we've once again encouraged boaters to do the draining and the inspection process on their own on the launch ramps prior to arriving at our inspection station. A few minutes later, we're developing material asking them to remove some of the raw water filters like sea strainers before inspection, both at Lake Powell, but also to leave those filters and those drain plugs out until they're inspected at their next destination. Not only will it kind of expedite the process and allow them to get on the road faster, but it doesn't completely remove them from the process, and it lets them know that they continue to have an important role to play in all this. And I guess it's also important to note that we're also messaging this as a way to have the public help us avoid having to make judgment calls as to whether that boat that shows up at one of our reservoirs and has mussel shells or mussels in the sea strainer would require some sort of dry time quarantine. These calls are incredibly complex and difficult to make on our part, and they don't always end up in the public's favor. So we want them to help us by keeping that sea strainer out so we don't have to make those judgment calls, and we don't have to tell that boater, hey, your boat has to stay out of the water for the next 2 weeks, or in severe cases up to 1 month. So if we're putting more responsibility on the boater through our modified protocols, we also need a way to check that they're accepting that responsibility and that they're doing what's asked of them. In Utah, we're very lucky in the sense that our watercraft interdiction program is primarily run out of our law enforcement section. And in many cases, in most cases, in fact, that's a really good thing and a huge advantage for us. I think it also sometimes pushes us to bring the hammer down, so to speak, and overlook the education part because it's just easier for us to do it that way at sometimes. So we have began re-implementing a lot of these, what we term administrative checkpoints. And for those of you that are hunters or no hunters, very similar to those deer checkpoints that you see along highways and on the road, checking for compliance with the law. We typically conduct 6 to 8 of these annually, mostly on highways leading out of Lake Powell, but also on other highways and pinch points around the state, like those going into the Flaming Gorge National Recreation Area, for example. And the education piece is super important, mostly because it's a great opportunity for us to interact one-on-one with the boater, but have that interaction be with one of our law enforcement officers. So I guess the significance is often elevated in the eyes of the boater, But in all honesty, too, it also comes down to a show of force on our part, saying that, hey, we take this seriously, and so should you. This is a big deal. So we're all aware of the saying, where there is a crisis, there's also an opportunity. And I believe that's the case here as well. The first opportunity is one to rally stakeholders around this idea of access. We have momentum around the access issue right now. So how do we maintain that momentum to make improvements to our collective programs? How do we keep those partners and stakeholders at the table, especially the ones that haven't been really fully engaged up to this point? We also have an opportunity to take a step back for a second and evaluate our programs. And the first kind of evaluation we did was on our communication. With the fluidity of the situation at Lake Powell and really all across Utah, communication was extremely important, and more important now more than ever. And I guess gaps in communication in our communication structure became much more apparent and required us to kind of redefine and clarify those communication structures. Our poor supervisors at Lake Powell probably felt like they were on a carousel because the direction down to them changed literally on a daily basis and sometimes on an hourly basis based on what was happening at Lake Powell, which ramps were going to be opening up, who was going to be responsible for what. So communication became paramount, especially under this scenario. And we began holding, weekly calls, virtual meetings with all of our AIS staff. And the one thing we learned is, it's been a stressful time for all of us. And sometimes we just need some support from people doing the same work to get through these times and to bounce ideas off, or heck, just to voice some frustration. And I think, over the last couple of months, our interdiction team has actually grown closer than it's ever been. The other kind of aspect of our program that we evaluated was we started developing contingency plans. I mean, we couldn't ever have kind of anticipated something like this, but it does remind us that crazy things do happen, and we have to maybe not have a specific plan in place, but have an idea of the approach we may take if that does indeed happen. So, for example, right now, a lot of us are facing the decision of what actions do we take if our funding is cut? How do we begin preparing for that? How would we defend whatever approach we decide to take to our stakeholders and the public? And if we can't hire inspectors at a location, what are our other options? Can we reallocate resources? Can we move inspection stations around? How does virtual training play into this? We also evaluate the efficiency and effectiveness of our programs, and how do we take advantage of those years when funding is stable? And I know in Utah, we focus a lot on, what systems we can put in place now that when we have funding that have maybe a significant upfront investment, but will serve us kind of more in the long run, particularly at times like this. And we're talking about, a lot of you will recognize this, the automated data entry, the dip tanks, those types of ideas that are significant investments, but man, they would sure be nice at a time like now. And then, the private sector has a role to play in this, especially when state budgets are getting cut. In what ways would the private sector perhaps be more capable of responding to certain situations like this? And what are those roles, and how do we begin making progress in not only establishing them, but supporting their development and ensuring that they're robust enough to kind of stand up and get the work done when the capacity of state government is reduced? And then just finally, public participation. We begin redefining those roles and the balance between education, law enforcement, and the public's responsibility, realizing that we all want to maintain access, but sometimes it takes something like this, some catastrophe, to make us realize that a lot of times we often take that access for granted. And yeah, thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you, Nate. And then next up, we have Josh Shorb, the supervisor with the Park County, Wyoming Weed and Pest Control District. Go ahead, Josh. Are you there, Josh? Okay. In case Josh is having a technical issue, we can just go ahead. Oh, I can hear you now, Josh.
Okay. Sorry about that. Thanks a lot, Bill. I appreciate you've extended me an invitation to speak to the webinar, and thank you everybody for taking time out of your day to attend this. I don't have any slides presented are ready for presentation right now. I just kind of wanted to answer some of the questions that are out there that are on a sheet that I have. Park County Weed and Pest Control District in Wyoming, in the 23 counties in Wyoming, every county is represented by a local weed and pest control district, and we have our own stable funding. We're funded by a countywide property tax, and what we do, one of our main jobs is to coordinate all of the noxious weed and pest treatments and invasive species issues within the county boundaries and watershed boundaries. So what we do, we take all of the property tax monies that we have, and we also partner with our state and federal agencies through cooperative agreements, contracts, and we try to come up with a cohesive plan on how to attack noxious weeds, pests, and invasive species on landscape levels. So in my county, which includes the north half of Yellowstone Park, we partner with, or we work with the National Park Service, the Forest Service, the BLM, the Bureau of Reclamation, Wyoming State Lands Division, Wyoming Game and Fish Department, Wyoming State Parks, and a lot of private landowners. And we try to take all the problems and mold those together to solve the problem at hand. One of the issues that I would like to discuss or to address right now is some of the budgetary problems related to COVID-19. In my county, we get 34% of our property tax assessment from oil, and I'm sure a lot of you know that the sale of fossil fuels has gone through the floor recently for a 2-week period there. The majority of the oil that is produced in Park County is traded under the Western Canadian Select type of oil, and it was trading in the negative territory for 2 weeks. During that time, the U.S. benchmark was trading at $37 or negative $37 per barrel. So one of my big concerns is we've had this stable funding for a long time, and we've put together good programs to address noxious weeds and invasive species over decades, as that could be really impacted just because of the funds that are going to be available either to us as a district and the reduction of state and federal funds that are going to be available, as well as the money that private landowners put into their own money to fund these overall projects. So some of the things that we are looking at here in Park County is we have a list of what we call our high priority species. We have 11 species within the county that we consider our highest priority. So we're looking at reducing that list down to 3 or 4 different plants, and that's what we're going to focus on. This year, I've already reduced out of this current fiscal year that ends on June 30th. For the last 3 months of this fiscal year, I've had to take out about 20% of my entire year's budget in those 3 months. We're also going to continue that going into next year. I know we're going to have problems with funding, and so we're trying to cut things right now so we don't come to an abrupt stop or fall off a cliff and have to abandon our programs entirely, but maybe we could glide down to an easy landing depending on how long the economic impacts of COVID go on. So that's one thing that we're doing. One of the things that we are going to continue doing is our inventory and our survey and our monitoring for not only the our high priority noxious weeds that we do have, but some new species to the state. Well, we have Medusa head and Ventonata. I think they were located in the northeast portion of the state of Wyoming in 2016, and their presence is all over the western U.S. So we're still looking for that. We are still going to save money in our budget and make that a priority. So if we do find something like that, we still have money available. We can address that while it's very early in its stage. I don't want to go out there and spend a lot of money on programs that are going to have to be funded year after year when I could try to nip something in the bud right out of the gate. Right now, we have a board of directors that are appointed by the county commissioners. I have 7 board members, and probably in the next couple of months, we are going to sit down and come up with a priority plan on how to spend our reserves. We do have district reserves, and we need to have their input and working with private landowners and the county commissioners. How do we envision spending those in the next couple of fiscal years if we're forced to draw those down? So that's one of the things that I'm real concerned about that, and we're going to be taking time to address those. In terms of protecting ourselves and our crews from COVID-19, in my county, I have the office locked down. We sell a lot of pesticides to the public to come in and they want to do their own control. We have a quote unquote drive up window into our office. People come up, ask us questions, discuss cost share programs that we offer. We conduct a transaction through the window, and then we have a warehouse man, and he comes out and he delivers the chemical out to them. So we don't allow the public in here. We're trying to maintain as much social distancing within the office as is practical. The seasonal crews that have come on, that's another thing. I've had to reduce my treatment crews from 13 down to 8. One of the reasons we picked that number is I have 8 trucks available for my seasonal employees. So right now we're doing some training. We are trying to put 2 people per truck, but if things got worse in this area, we have been one of the lower impacted areas within the state of Wyoming, and Wyoming is one of the lower impacted states overall in the nation. If things do get worse, then we can put 1 person per truck. One of the concerns that we have is we are a gateway community to Yellowstone, being Cody, Wyoming. And since they opened the park a few weeks ago, we've seen every license plate in the U.S. here, including someone from Hawaii that had their car shipped over, and they're in Yellowstone. So that's one of the concerns that we have, is with people coming from all over the nation and congregating here. Like Nathan mentioned, that could really impact our program. If we had somebody test positive here, we have a smaller shop to work out of that can place our entire crew in operation and quarantine for 14 days. And that could really delay our plans for getting to these invasive species on a timely manner. Several other districts around the state of Wyoming are doing similar things. A lot of hand sanitizers, social distancing, trying to wipe down all of the trucks and the equipment. There's shared devices, tablets, things of that nature. Many districts still are not allowing the public into their offices, or they're trying to keep crews segregated. Some of the larger districts that have large crews, they're almost operating in pods. So if one crew or area tests positive for COVID-19 and they have to self-quarantine, they'll have other separate pods that they can continue doing work on in the year. Many districts are going to try to keep 2-man crews or 2 people working together for the entire summer, so they won't be exposing everybody. If they do test positive, they'll only be exposing one other person. If any of you have ever managed seasonal employees, that's easier said than done, just due to personality conflicts and problems that arise over the summer with trying to keep 2 people together all year long. Another recommendation that I would come up with, and that we've been trying to do around here for a while, when we're actually treating invasive species out there, we've been adding pre-emergent herbicides to those mixes. So when we treat the weeds, we have an herbicide out there that's going to extend the control, especially for new seedlings, and hopefully that'll prevent new populations from being spread by seeds via wind or mud or whatever vector that might be causing that. And we're going to be expanding that this year. It's going to be another cost that we're going to incur this year, but if our budgets continue to decline, that's going to give us some extended control out there that we might not otherwise be able to achieve. So Bill, that's a few of the thoughts that I have written down.
Thank you, Josh. That was great. And then, so next up, our final presenter is Lauri Hanauska-Brown with the Nongame Wildlife Management Bureau Chief for Montana Fish and Wildlife and Parks. So go ahead, Lauri.
Hey, thank you, Bill. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, thanks. All right, so yeah, I'm with Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks. I'm going to give a different spin here on what we've been covering, but Karen at the beginning gave a good intro or a good lead for me here. You know, she said, why do we care about invasive species? And the third reason was to protect biodiversity, and that's going to be more the focus of this talk, I think, than maybe some of the previous talks, but I will get into some of the preventative measures and whatnot. And I'm really going to talk about a group of species, which is bats, and then I'll cover with just one side black-footed ferret and how this pandemic has impacted management of those guys. So why bats again? It seems like when bad things happen in the world, bats are often the ones who get blamed, and indeed, we believe that bats passed on the virus that causes COVID-19 in Asia, probably to a middleman, if you will, species that transferred it to humans. So, you know, this isn't new for bats. Again, they've carried lots of different pathogens like Ebola and Hendra and SARS. And for anyone who read the book Spillover by David Quammen, the second chapter, I believe, ends in a statement similar to, or it says, you know, that's the tree, the bloody tree where the bats congregate. And in that particular story, it was the bats congregating in a tree over a place where a horse used to loaf, and that indeed resulted in a human infection. And that was for Hendra. So bats have the ability to carry these really toxic viruses in their system, and it's unclear why that is, but it appears that bats are little superheroes in terms of living with these viruses. Unfortunately, when they get stressed and when we push them or we push into their habitats, viruses tend to build up, and that's when we see a spillover. So North American bats are known to have alpha coronaviruses and some beta coronaviruses, but they're non-SARS beta coronaviruses, so they are different than the virus that has caused COVID-19. Really quickly, I just want to point out that the bats of the Americas are a suborder way at the top of this slide, very far in the evolutionary tree from the horseshoe bat, which is at the bottom, and that is the bat that we believe has caused a number of these epidemics or pandemics over the years. So pretty significant evolutionary development there, and science has shown that some of these coronaviruses are very specific to the genus or the family of bats. So it's possible that our bats don't have the ability to carry this one, but that remains to be seen. Zoonotics travel both ways, and I'm going to talk primarily about this here because we've been thinking and in the news hearing about the virus moving from left to right on this slide here, and that's from animals to humans. But we have to remember that it goes the other way. So the public fear at the very beginning of this was that we were all going to end up with COVID-19 from bats, and I'm going to put a twist on that because the community of bat managers and researchers came up with this idea that maybe the transmission from right to left is also pretty critical to consider. So this simulated a USGS Fish and Wildlife Service risk assessment, and the risk assessment was taken on to help kind of inform and confirm the community of folks looking at this risk and to help guide us down the road. The evaluation considered the risk of transmission from humans to bats by 3 different groups. That's the research and management branch that many of us work in, the pest control operators, those folks often come into close contact with bats, and then anyone conducting bat rehabilitation obviously has very close contact. The picture there, which I think you guys can see, is Gwyneth Paltrow blowing on a poker chip, and this is from the movie Contagion. There's been some dialogue as to the similarities of COVID-19 outbreak and the movie Contagion. They appear to be pretty close. And the reason I put this in here is because folks that handle bats often blow on them. And we do that for looking at reproductive status, as well as to stop them from actively biting us when we're handling them. And anyone who's following this knows that respiratory droplets are a transmission of the virus. And so we very quickly identified that if we were going to handle bats, we probably should stop blowing on them. The evaluation did not look at the risk of transmission from the general public or recreational cavers. There's some real concern about those groups being ignored. In Montana, we have a great relationship with our caving community, and I want to ensure their activities aren't going to be harmful for the bats, and they are asking that question as well to make sure that they're thinking about their activities. And then the risk of transmission from the general public is a big question and a big concern for lots of folks, because we obviously have situations where a bat has maybe been in a house. If there's been no potential rabies exposure, the windows and doors are open and off goes the bat. And if there was some sort of virus persisting in that house, again, from respiratory droplets of a symptomatic or asymptomatic person, we could have just put a bat back out into the wild that actually had contracted the virus. So I don't know if any future assessments will look at that risk, but it is something that we are talking about. Okay, within the risk assessment, you have to really look at 2 things, and I think this is a little similar to some of the invasive species discussions. You know, there's an event that brings an invasive species. In this case, it's exposure, so exposure from a human to a bat when a human is actively shedding the virus, and then there's an infection period, and I would guess for invasive species, we might call that an establishment period. But there are 2 things we have to look at. What is the exposure from humans or for bats from humans, and then what's the replication of a virus within the bat itself, and then the population. Okay, you know, unfortunately, a lot of our discussions within the community and even within this risk assessment are based on a lot of unknowns and a lot of uncertainties. And as we talked about what I should present on here today, I think this is actually a really important topic. You know, for some of the previous conversations, decisions are being made on the best available science, but also pretty standard things like hand washing and distancing. For this, we have to look at some other things that, again, are some pretty big unknowns. So, you know, we don't know what the risk is to bats because we don't know their susceptibility. And this is simply in terms of North American bats, which has been the group that we're looking at here. There's literature on some of this. There's not great literature on a lot of our questions. We're dealing with things based on preliminary results. We have ongoing laboratory trials, but we don't have a lot of hard data to really make recommendations or decisions on how we reduce the risk to our North American bats. In particular, for this risk assessment, there were some very specific uncertainties. You know, I should say that the speed at which this risk assessment began was really fascinating. It was weeks into COVID really ramping up in the States, and a team was assembled, a team of experts in bat ecology, in disease ecology. Data was gathered, and folks got right down to it of trying to answer some of the questions we had. But in the end, they only considered one bat species. They only considered transmission during the active season, which, as I mentioned, we work with our cavers, and we actually access a lot of our caves during the winter time. And so that period of exposure was not considered in this risk assessment. We don't know much about the transmission probabilities from bat to bat. You know, we think about other diseases like white nose syndrome, and we assume that bats in close contact are infecting each other. That's probably going to be true here. We don't know about the shedding rate of the virus from asymptomatic people, et cetera, et cetera. So all of this risk assessment and all of our decisions to date on management efforts are really being made on a lot of uncertainties. So really briefly, I'm not going to dive into this. The risk assessment findings came out literally yesterday for the public, so they've finally been published. Again, some of those findings helped confirm the direction that we as bat managers were headed, and then it helps inform where we go from here. It was determined that there is non-negligible risk of transmission from humans to bats. And one piece of example data there is a researcher who's actively shedding the virus, whether they know it or not, could in fact expose 50% of the bats they handle, and they could infect 17%. It's important to note there, I say standard protocols. Obviously, if we're blowing on bats to determine reproductive status, we're not wearing masks. So I think it's pretty safe to say that bat handling in the past did not involve the wearing of masks, certainly gloves in a lot of cases. And so when you look at the three groups overall, the highest risk was actually rehabilitation activities. Obviously, those people have very close and very frequent contact with animals. Medium risk was what a lot of us work on, and that's research and monitoring. And then lowest but still non-negligible are the impacts or the potential transmission from wildlife control operators who are maybe in an environment where they're interacting closely. I mentioned that standard protocols for bat handling, at least from the research and monitoring side, have been good, but not necessarily perfect in terms of this discussion. And the risk assessment showed that we could reduce the risk of transmission by over 90% if we simply use the right protective gear, and that would include things like N95 masks. So, yeah, we can come up with a list of recommendations, but none of them are easy, and the results of, taking new steps are in some cases very complex. So one of the things early on that folks had to consider was the basic taking of personal protective equipment from human healthcare needs. So it was agreed to pretty quickly in the bat community that we did not want to be viewed by the public as taking equipment needed for other priority needs. Biosecurity practices are great to talk about, but when we're talking about someone rehabilitating bats in their laundry room, it's pretty hard to enforce. And that's true for a lot of the pest control operator systems as well. We don't, in Montana, license pest control operators, and that's going to be different in each state, but we have a lack of regulation over those folks. Appropriate decontamination between sites. People have been doing this for a while to prevent the movement of the fungus that causes white nose syndrome. But in some cases, we don't have great control over that either. That certainly is something that we want to encourage pest control operators to consider as they move from attic to attic, perhaps, and it would be important for researchers doing the same. We in Montana have communicated with wildlife control operators with some of our concerns and offered them some recommendations. We don't allow rehabilitation of bats here, but I know some states have done the same in terms of communicating with their rehabilitators on what best practices should include. So suspension of rehabilitation activities seems like a really great idea, very easy for states that don't allow it. But for other states, they had great concern that a member of the public calling in a injured bat, maybe that was in their house, will perhaps take the step of letting the bat go or rehabilitating it themselves if there are no formal rehabilitation options. And so that was a concern by some of the states. And again, that goes back to the concerns about public interaction with bats that we either don't know about or that we allow in some way by not offering them other options. And then obviously, we have suspended, most states have prohibited any sort of live capture or monitoring where handling is involved. for this year, and that simply results in a loss of data. And for white nose syndrome monitoring, it's kind of a bust this spring, at least for anyone who had April, May, or June sampling planned, and we've had to readjust, and we're looking at guano sampling now exclusively for the states that have prohibited handling. Basically, everything is a trade-off between human health and conservation right now, and so those are all the things that are being weighed by folks in the bat management community. My last slide is just to cover what's happening with black-footed ferrets, and they came into the picture pretty quickly because domestic ferrets and cats were proven to be susceptible to this virus in laboratory tests. And again, as I mentioned, there's still lots of ongoing laboratory testing and experiments to include actively infecting bats with the virus to see how North American bats might react. But precautions generally for black-footed ferrets are a little easier to implement because of their federally listed status. There's kind of one overarching regulatory body. So the Fish and Wildlife Service has the ability to send out direction to all the states, all the cooperators, captive facilities, et cetera, with clear direction on how they want them to proceed. So it's a little different than trying to contact bat rehabilitators and pest control operators that may or may not be listed in some sort of licensing capacity. So standard precautions with ferrets, social distancing of both humans and ferrets. So they have ferrets spaced out in a broader array right now than maybe they were when they were each in their own individual cage next to one another. Staff isolation, rotating staff, so you've got certain groups, has been mentioned in some of the previous presentations. Capture and vaccination operations can take part this, or can be conducted this year, as long as they're part of an approved site work plan, again, by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And then there are vaccine trials currently underway with black-footed ferrets that may, inform vaccine use for lots of things or purposes. And as I said, a lot of that's going on with bats as well. So with that, Bill, that's kind of all I have, but I am looking forward to questions. Thanks for having me.
That was great. Thank you, Lauri. And so that was our final presenter. And so we are moving on now to the Q&A section of the webinar. So we've got some good questions in so far, but I'd encourage all the attendees, if you have anything, questions you'd like me to ask the panelists, please send them now using the Q&A function on the top bar or the attendee chat function. Either way, I'll be able to see them. So I'll jump into the attendee questions in a minute. Before I do that, though, I just want to ask one general question to all of the panelists. And I think all of us going through the coronavirus times have, there's certain things both in our professional lives that we've been forced to do due to quarantine that I'm certain we can't wait for those practices to end and are not going to continue when the quarantine is over. But I think, there are certainly things that we've learned that are beneficial and we're going to carry on with us in our normal professional or personal lives after all of this is over. So my question to the attendees, are there management practices that you learned, that you've enacted because of coronavirus that you didn't know you needed, but now you're going to keep in place now that the quarantine's over? So I'll turn that over. Any of the panelists who have any thoughts on that, feel free to go ahead.
Yeah, Bill, this is Nate Owens from Utah. I think the one element that we are certainly going to keep going forward is our virtual training for our inspectors and decontaminators. We weren't quite sure about that when we started diving into that. It was a necessity, so we ended up going that route, but it's actually proven to be probably a much more efficient way to at least present the initial training material to some of our new staff. And I think that is something that we will continue to improve and build upon probably this fall going into winter, so we have a more robust virtual training element next year.
And I'll add something, Bill. is Lauri. I think we often think about, wildlife diseases being transferred to humans. That's something everyone's always, everyone's got on their mind, whether it's CWD or brucellosis or white nose syndrome. We kind of look at those diseases and we ask the question, can we get this? And I think with this one, at least for me, it's been interesting to think about it the other way. And yeah, it sounds kind of silly, but when you think about blowing on an animal, and there's diseases that can be transferred with respiratory exhalations, that kind of makes me think, well, duh, we probably shouldn't be doing that anyways, even though it means we need to adjust our techniques a little. But we know that black-footed ferrets are susceptible to some of the influenzas that humans carry. And so I think for wildlife managers, it's important for us to kind of rethink maybe that transmission from humans to bats or humans to wildlife in ways that we maybe don't always.
I agree. That makes sense. Any other panelists? Any thoughts on that?
I would add, Bill, that while it seems obvious today, kind of prior to this pandemic, I personally had never really put much thought towards the significant amount of exposure that our inspectors have while performing their duties, interacting with the public, touching all these surfaces that are on people's personal equipment. So I certainly see some of the changes persisting relating to personal cleanliness as well as cleanliness of our workspaces being something that continues for our programs.
Bill, I would second that latest comment, is just trying to be more clean and sanitary, things of that nature, social distancing.
All right. Any other thoughts on the panel on that question? Okay, well, I'll move on to a question that we had from one of the audience members, and it was submitted while Karen was presenting. So the question is, Karen, so having the relationship between COVID-19 and invasive species management, the question is, so if the proven way to reduce the spread of COVID-19 involves lockdown or contact tracing, how do you see that translating to invasive species management? Do you have suggestions for the shutdown part?
So, Bill, this is Karen. So I think that there were some examples of the shutdown part given in some of the panelists' talks today. So a 30-day dry time, limiting movement of boats, limiting movement of soil. I think that is, to me, that is shutting down. We realize and recognize the fact that for a lockdown, it can be strategic and it can vary in length of time. And so I think that, to me, is, let's go to California. California limits the movement of the transportation of fruit from outside the state into that state to limit the spread of potential invasive agricultural pests for their fruit production. So I view that kind of as a shutdown. That is an invasive species management practice. And then if we think about contact tracing, typically we, on the movement of, let's say, gravel or firewood, we want burn it where you buy it. For gravel, it's, use it and make sure you know what's in that gravel, and it could be potentially certified weed-free. But I think we kind of do that already. And that, to me, is our shutdown and contact tracing, knowing where things come from or limiting the introduction and the movement of things.
It does seem to me like there are a couple common invasive species practices. The biosecurity in early detection, rapid response, and the use of environmental DNA, that definitely there is some overlap with the pathogen, the way that you would treat a virus. So I think that's a good point. So another question that we got was, while Josh was presenting, we had a question coming in from a presenter saying that I coordinate with a cooperative Invasive Species Management Association, and I am looking for ideas for alternatives to regular outreach and education and work days with the public. How are others troubleshooting these to meet grant metrics? Any thoughts from that from Josh or any other panelists?
Thanks, Bill. I see that question right now, and I'm just taking a look at it. I think it would have to be, kind of a virtual meeting thing. We have a person on staff, and a large part of her job is outreach and providing educational opportunities to the public, doing a lot of inspections and just putting on educational programs. And we've had to cancel a lot of those just because of social distancing. A lot of different events have been canceled. So unfortunately, I don't have a real good answer for that at this time.
Well, that makes sense. It could be a persistent challenge. Any other panelists? Any questions thoughts about that?
Bill, this is Karen. So I agree with the comment about the video training and the video outreaching. And then for work days with the public, I think for some of the land areas that I know that have had volunteers, they are really focusing on those regular volunteers and really relying upon them because they're fewer in number, but then those are the ones that they have a pretty high level of trust with. And so unfortunately that reduces the number of work days with the public, but it still allows for some. Certainly all of the CDC guidelines are taken into effect too.
Bill, building on that a little bit, what Karen just said, in the last 2 months since really this COVID broke out, our pesticide sales have been up 30%. And it kind of surprised me a little bit, just, with the unemployment and people losing their jobs and stuff like that. But I think there is something to they're cooped up and they're bored. And so they don't have anything else to do. So controlling noxious weeds or invasive species is a good thing to do. So I guess people could play at that angle.
No, that makes sense. Certainly, my home garden looks a lot better with the extra time at home, and I imagine that just happens at a larger scale across the West. So I think, yep, that certainly makes sense. Any other thoughts on that from the panelists? Okay, so we had another question from the audience. This is directed to all of the presenters, and it is to what extent, if any, is COVID-19 testing and tracing playing a role in your management of staff and crews?
Yeah, Bill, this is Nate again. This one's been a challenge for us for sure. We originally started out, since most of our crew at Lake Powell is typically hired from, I would say the majority of them are hired from back east. This was something that we had to confront fairly early on. We initially had just a complete ban on out-of-state hires, but since really that wasn't an option for Lake Powell, there was some flexibility given to our program, and so we referenced the Johns Hopkins pandemic map with their hotspots identified to kind of gauge what the risk would be of having someone come into Utah from one of those areas. But then you also start hearing the news about the testing really is not very accurate by any stretch of the imagination. And those maps are populated with data that is collected based on test results, but obviously the testing being done in these different areas differs dramatically. So we ended up basically requiring a lot of our staff to undergo a 14-day quarantine, mostly in the state of Utah, which was a tough thing for us to do. We required them to come here and essentially quarantine in place. And sometimes we were able to provide a place to do that for 14 days before we would allow them to interact with our crew. We have since secured several camp trailers and those types of things for additional options for quarantining either people coming in from out of state that have been hired or people that come down with suspected COVID that we need to isolate immediately. In terms of tracing, we're not really involved in any of that. There's a state tracing team that many of my aquatics colleagues are part of that would tackle that as soon as it was reported to them.
Any other panelists with thoughts on that?
One thing I would add, Bill, and this is Robert, is while it's not have to do with our inspection and decontamination program, our aquatic invasive species sampling efforts have been significantly impacted by social distancing. We typically operate with crews of 3 individuals who spend all of their time together in boats and vehicles, and we are currently under the direction that we can't have more than 1 employee in a vehicle or on a boat. So we have had to significantly modify our sampling and monitoring program to be 1-person crews. We're currently only sampling from the shorelines as we don't want single people out there operating boats, so that has been a significant change for us.
Bill, I'll just add that here in Montana, I mean, our infection rate that's at least been measured is super low, but we do have a 14-day quarantine period for technicians or employees coming from out of state. I'm not tied in with the aquatic invasive species effort, so I can't answer on that. But honestly, I think the greater concern for me are the asymptomatic folks, and the risk assessment that was conducted said asymptomatic people can shed the virus for over 30 days. So you may have a perfectly healthy feeling person with no fever and no symptoms out handling wildlife, and we would have no indication that they may be infectious. So I can't respond to the tracing question specifically, but my concerns are great for that specific instance where we have asymptomatic folks handling animals. And I think that's true for all of the states, and that's why we've been very proactive on simply prohibiting capture at this time.
Bill, this is Karen. For some of our research projects, we may have a team, and maybe we'll have 4 to 6 people that traditionally would go out and work together to collect plant community data, or a variety, soil sampling, whatever. And what they have done is, because we were moving to the point of 1 person per vehicle, to be able to maintain that research and the responsibilities associated with that, effectively the researchers assigned those individuals, say there were 6 individuals, they assigned them to pods of 2. And those 2 individuals worked together and they traveled together. And they didn't want them to have to share hotel rooms if it was remote location, but if they had to share a hotel room, they would only share the hotel room with those 2 individuals, and then the other 2 and the other 2. And effectively, they did that so that if one of the individuals in a pod was infected, the other one obviously quarantined, but then there was still another pod or 2 to be able to continue that research. So that was one way they got around the 1 person per vehicle. They established that kind of that teamwork mentality that has been very successful in maintaining the productivity of some of our research projects.
And that reminds me of, we had a webinar 2 weeks ago as part of the WGA Working Lands Roundtable, where we brought in a wide variety of natural resource management experts, and we had Lloyd Knight from Idaho Department of Agriculture on, and he's also with the Western Invasive Species Council. He brought a perspective on that, but we also had someone just from the Bureau of Land Management speaking about how fire managers are dealing with this, and he mentioned that that's sort of the family model of the way that they're looking at wildfire crews in the age of coronavirus, is that really more so than even normal is fire crews move about the country and work is to keep them as a tight-knit family, and they essentially, as much as possible, only have contact with each other. So if one person gets it, it's at least limited to that family model. And so it sounds like that pod model is something that you're replicating as well.
Exactly.
Any other thoughts on this? The question for the panelists? So one question that occurred to me is just I was originally thinking about the question that for Karen about just the relationship between invasive species as a pathogen, the movement of invasive species and the movement of pathogens. But I think this also applies to Lauri's question as well, or presentation as well, is just that, there's a lot of similarity between invasive species, the movement of invasive species, and the movement of pathogens, and there's a lot of overlap on how those work and the impact on resources. I guess my question is, how much is there a communication between the infrastructure of invasive species managers and invasive disease experts? And does it get philosophical that at one point, at what point does a pathogen get managed by invasive species experts versus public health experts? So I guess my question is how much communication exists between those two fields, and do you think there's ways to improve that communication if needed?
I don't know if I have a well thought out answer, but I can give it a shot. So our interaction right now, I'm speaking just for Montana, with our public health officials is relatively strong in regards to bats. So there's obviously the nexus of rabies exposure. There's also white nose syndrome and how we are communicating with the public on that. And then we just work really hard as a team of multi-agency folks to make sure that the public understands the value of bats and trying to get rid of some of those old messages about bats being scary, and boy, that's more important now than ever. So we do already have that connection. We haven't had a ton of discussion on this particular topic of COVID-19. Everyone's obviously very busy if they work at Human and Health Services departments. But I can see that down the road, and I think particularly if we get to a place where we have some questions about tracing and moving biologists and whatnot around the landscape, it's possible that those folks can help us more than we're asking for their help right now.
Bill, from my perspective, this is Karen. From my perspective, it's mostly been academic in the sense that there are faculty that view invasive species as also potential for bioterrorism. And so I think obviously it needs to move outside of that. I may be coming from a region that I think Montana is a bit more progressive in that communication amongst their agencies than my state.
Okay. So my next question's in a similar vein about just communication between different sectors, and that is for Nathan with Utah. And then it sounds like you learned a lot about communication during the decisions and just the response and dealing with coronavirus in boat inspections and decontamination policies and procedures at Lake Powell. Is there one big takeaway from that that you learned from this lessons on how to better communicate in a rapidly evolving and changing situation? If there's one thing you want to convey to listeners, what would that be?
Yeah, that's a great question, Bill. And I guess it's not really a revelation, but I guess more of a reminder. Just ensure that the right people are involved in the right discussions. It seemed like there were too many people involved in a lot of the discussions at various levels within each of the agencies, and the communication between the levels broke down somewhat, and so there were discussions being had, but they weren't involving the right people and the people that were able to make those decisions. And so that's the lesson I learned, is when you're dealing with something like this, don't jump into having discussions. Make sure you get the right people involved first.
Nope, that makes sense, and that's broadly applicable to a lot of areas of management and communication. So that makes sense. And then, so Robert, I've got a question for you about, you know, that was a really great presentation on the work that you did to sort of reevaluate and modify inspection decontamination protocols on the fly. Could you just go on, let us know about the processes you have in place to look at those again, reevaluate them, update them in the future, 6 months, 12 months, on and on, as the coronavirus situation changes and then hopefully dissipates?
Yeah, certainly. Thanks, Bill. So this really was just kind of pitched to us as kind of a one-time project, at least within our decontamination think tank committee. But that being said, there are currently bi-weekly conference calls ongoing in the West to kind of discuss that interaction between COVID-19 and watercraft inspection and decontamination. So there's a constant conversation going on with this. If there's a problem that does need to be solved, our committee would certainly be glad to provide any technical expertise we can, and would certainly update our best practice recommendations as necessary. That being said, any guidelines that we have drafted are only recommendations, and each agency, of course, has their own authorities and resources and risk tolerances, and may or may not implement those changes that are recommended. So those changes really occur at the program level.
Great. Thank you. That sounds like a good process. And then, so another question. This is for Josh. And then, you know, there's something I've heard just talking with invasive species managers is that with the budgetary uncertainty coming everybody's way, is setting priorities. That's going to be key on trying to just pick which projects are the winners. Do you have any advice for the different groups out there who are now really going to have to go through and set priorities and maybe make some painful decisions about what they can and can't do in the face of limited budgets?
Yeah, that's a good question, Bill. What I would recommend is you know, you need to pare it down to a handful of species and to defend areas. I think that's what we're going to do. When we have you know, species in an area that we think we could either continue to decrease the population or at least hold the line, we're going to defend those areas and keep our inventory and surveying going on in those areas, and just kind of concede that you're going to lose ground in other areas and it's going to have to be picked up in, you know, in the years future. It's kind of a bummer that, you know, we've made a lot of progress in some areas and we're just going to have to let those go. So we're just going to pick a hill to defend, and that's where we're going to devote our resources and our personnel.
Those are certainly hard decisions to make. All right. Well, so we've got about 7 minutes left, so I probably only have time for 1 or 2 more questions. But so there's a question I was thinking about asking that occurred to me. I was watching Lauri's presentation, but I think it applies to all the panelists on the call. Is that you know, in the instance of the bat risk assessment for the interaction between COVID-19 and bats, you know, there's a lot of unknowns on what the science is, what the consequences management actions will have, things along those lines. And I think that's just applicable to coronavirus in general, both in our personal and professional lives. You're trying to make the best decision you can with a limited amount of information and various degrees of confidence in that information. In invasive species management, and coronavirus is no different. So are there any advice or any best practices for making the best decision you can with limited information about the sort of the knowns and unknowns of what you're dealing with? So anyone have any thoughts on that as we wrap up?
I'll make one comment on that, and I didn't say this during my presentation. The confidence intervals around all of the actual numbers produced from that risk assessment were pretty big. And that's to be expected because it was based on a lot of expert opinion and all these uncertainties that I pointed out. But I do think the decision made by a lot of states was based on the following. There's probably little risk of humans transmitting this virus to bats. There's probably very little risk of North American bats being susceptible and experiencing some sort of population decline, but not knowing for sure is simply too risky, because while it may be low risk of transmission or great impact to the bats, the consequences are very high. And we already have so many threats against our bats across the country that we just simply decided, even with little risk, consequences are too high, we're going to go with the very conservative, proactive approach. So we made that decision with a lot of uncertainties based on that assessment.
Yeah, Bill, this is Nate. I would kind of echo that. I think one thing you need to look at is what are the potential consequences if you're wrong, and are you willing to live with those? And then secondly, every decision we made, we put up against our division's strategic plan, so to speak, and the values laid out in that document. And as long as the decisions were aligned with those values, we felt like we could justify those decisions because those were representations of what we felt like were priorities and were important to the division and had the backing of the department as well. And any decision made against those would be very hard to defend and probably jeopardize the credibility we had with the public.
That makes sense. Any other thoughts from panelists? Okay. One final question, and it's sort of just an all-encompassing question of all. I think everyone here is presented with a lot of challenges on coronavirus in their work. Is there one question, and some progress has been made towards some of those things, I'm sure, but there's other things that I'm sure no progress has been made at all. What keeps you up at night, really? What are the big problems that you still don't have an answer to, and you're still trying to find solutions to? And then maybe hopefully other folks on this call might have some perspective or be able to contact you later if you've got that. So, but what are really the biggest challenges you face ahead?
Bill, this is Nate again. I wonder how we can possibly keep up with the amount of boating traffic that continues to increase every year, especially if funding either kind of stagnates or even, due to this pandemic, potentially decreases. How do we keep up with that workload? Because in the invasive species world, all it takes is, kind of one reservoir to become infested, and then the dominoes can quickly start falling. So that's our big challenge: is how do we maintain the capacity to deal with this, knowing that population is increasing, boating is increasing, and we don't have any immediate answer to those.
Yeah, Bill, this is Josh, and my big concern is the health and safety of my crews and sending them out there in the field to do their job and asking them to do this, knowing that we have fewer resources. And during this meeting, I just got an email informing me that the income that I was expecting this month is down 6.7% over what I was expecting. So those are the types of things that keep me up at night.
And I would maybe add, from my perspective, again, just centric to bats, the reason we don't want to transmit the virus from humans to bats is because we could create a new reservoir of the virus that in years to come could come back to humans, and then we create this cycle that we simply can't get out of. But we only have so much control over that. So I mentioned the idea of public interactions with bats that we don't know about, that we can't possibly control. There's a lot that's out of our hands, frankly, in terms of preventing any sort of transmission that could create a reservoir. And it's just out of our hands, but we can worry about it, I guess.
Bill, this is Karen, and I can't imagine. I don't have to deal with the budget issues. I don't have to deal with the staff health and safety of their potential exposure to coronavirus. And so mine may sound a little lesser than that because those are so tremendously important and challenging. But for me, what keeps me up at night is the fact that when I have a new crop of students come into my class that I know are going to go into natural resource management, and they have a limited knowledge about invasive species, and they are in college, my fear is that we have no way to educate the public. So if there's any way we can help educate the public to help reduce the pressure on all of your staff, and maybe help harness their energies and work effort to control weeds in their garden, weeds in their rangelands. That to me is a big challenge that could potentially help a tremendous amount.
And Robert, any thoughts?
Yeah, I would just kind of go on top of what Nate said, and something that I am just very concerned about at the moment is just employee fatigue. And we are seeing record visitation numbers. It's not even hot yet. I'm expecting these visitation numbers just to continue to rise. And I know some of our employees out there are already tired, and I worry that if we can't keep them engaged, then our quality of inspections may decline, which could have significant implications. So I'm just trying to find ways to keep people motivated to continue to do the job at the highest level.
All right, well, thank you. And I hate to end on a sort of a dour note like that, but I think it's really important for folks just to come together and talk about some of the biggest obstacles, and hopefully just collectively with the folks on the phone and the folks who listen to this, we can all come together and try to find solutions to those. So I would like to thank the panelists very much. I really thought this was a great webinar. I thought it was really productive. I thought it was a great conversation. I'd like to thank all the attendees for joining as well. That was a wonderful event. And so with that, I'll just conclude. This is the second webinar in this series for the WGA Working Lands Roundtable on the COVID-19 invasive species management and natural resource management. And just thank you to the folks at the Pacific Northwest Economic Region for helping us to pull this together and co-host this. You've been a great partner in that. So I just encourage you, a recording of this will be up on the WGA website later this afternoon, that you can watch it again on YouTube and share, and more information about future webinars are at westgov.org. So thank you all, and I hope to see you at our next webinar, which is on June 12th, and it's going to be on the impacts of COVID-19 to gateway communities, to national parks and recreation areas. So with that, I'll sign off. Thank you, everybody, for a great webinar, and stay tuned for more events.